6 kamikazes, 4 bombs, dozens of attacking aircraft. All of this rained down on a single destroyer in a single day. And you know what? It survived. But wait, that's not even the craziest part. Because this ship didn't just survive the hell off the coast of Okinawa. It fought. To the last bullet, to the last man standing. And the commander, just think about this. The commander literally held onto his bridge with his teeth, refusing to surrender. How is such a thing even possible? Where does a piece of steel and human flesh get such a will to live? Today, I'm going to tell you a story that the textbooks often gloss over. A story about what was actually happening on board during those terrifying hours. About decisions made in conditions of absolute chaos. And about one detail of this battle that still makes historians shake their heads in disbelief. USS Laffey, a ship destined to die several times over. And every time, it said no. Stay with me until the end, and you'll understand why sailors called it the ship that would not die, and why it still carries that nickname with pride today. But to understand how this miracle became possible, we need to go back to where it all began, into the very heart of the American steel machine. In 1941, the United States didn't just enter the war, they woke a volcano. Righteous anger over Pearl Harbor transformed into what America did best: production. Billions of dollars flowed into shipyards, and steel began to take shape with frightening speed. While admirals argued over the tactics of battleships and aircraft carriers, the real war was being carried on the shoulders of other ships. Destroyers. They were the workhorses of the fleet. The dirty work always fell to them. Guarding convoys in the frozen Atlantic, hunting submarines, rescuing downed pilots, and covering amphibious landings. They needed many of them. A lot of them. American industry responded with the Fletcher class. It was, perhaps, the most successful project of its time. Fast, maneuverable, well-armed. Over the years of the war, 175 such ships left the slips. It was an armada capable of drowning any fleet in the world by sheer numbers alone. It seemed, why change what already worked perfectly? But war dictates its own rules. The enemy grew angrier, planes flew faster, and threats became deadlier. The admirals needed a ship that didn't just escort, but killed. And then, the designers did the impossible. They took the Fletcher hull, widened it slightly, added weight, and created the Allen M. Sumner class. If the Fletcher was a soldier, the Sumner was a special ops commando. The main difference was immediately obvious. Instead of 5 single guns, the new destroyers received 3 twin turrets. 6 5-inch guns capable of unleashing a hurricane of fire on surface and air targets. This was a 20% increase in firepower in the forward salvo. Plus, dozens of anti-aircraft barrels, 40mm Bofors, and 20mm Ehrlichens. This ship was a floating Hedgehog, impossible to approach without the risk of a lethal sting. In 1944, hull number DD-724 slid off the ways. It was named Laffey, in honor of the first destroyer of that name, which had died heroically in the Battle of Guadalcanal, fighting a Japanese battleship at point-blank range. The new Laffey had to live up to that name. Sailors are superstitious people. Naming a ship after a sunken vessel is either a challenge to fate or an invitation to a new tragedy. But the crew of the new Laffey believed in their steel. They looked at those powerful twin guns and felt invincible. But there was one detail they tried not to think about at the time. The engineers had packed too much heavy weaponry into a relatively small hull. The ship turned out to be top-heavy. Skeptics whispered that under serious damage, it would simply capsize and sink like a stone. None of them could have imagined that soon, this ship would face a test that would silence all critics. And it would begin not in the Pacific, but off the shores of Europe. June 1944. The English Channel met them with leaden skies and an icy wind. It wasn't just water. It was the largest armada in human history. Operation Overlord. D-Day. For most ships, this meant landing troops and providing cover. But for the brand new Laffey, it was its first real exam. Its crew, Boys from Iowa, Texas, and New York had been civilians only yesterday. Today, they looked through their sights at the French coast, which the Germans had turned into an impregnable fortress. When the landing began, the horizon vanished in smoke. Laffey took its position off Utah Beach. Its task sounded simple: suppress shore fortifications. But in reality, it meant an artillery duel with concrete bunkers. The destroyer's 5-inch guns worked like jackhammers. Shell casings hit the deck with such a clang that ears rang even through helmets. They cleared the path for the infantry, literally chewing German machine gun nests out of the rocks. But the real hell began a little later, near the port of Cherbourg. Here, the Germans had prepared thoroughly. Heavy coastal batteries with a caliber of 280 millimeters. These were monsters, capable of tearing a destroyer apart with a single hit. Laffey and other ships closed the distance, drawing fire upon themselves to distract the Germans from the battleships. The water around the destroyer boiled. Huge pillars of water from falling shells rose higher than the masts, drenching the bridge and the optics. The ship was tossed from side to side like a toy. That was when fate winked at the ship for the first time. One of the German shells exploded right next to the hull. Shrapnel raked the superstructures, cut cables, and wounded men. But the most terrifying thing happened a second later. A second shell passed literally a meter from the hull, blasting the plating with heat and a shockwave. But it didn't hit. If the German battery gunner had turned his wheel just half a degree more, Laffey's story would have ended right there, in the cold waters off France. But the shell went into the depths. The crew realized one thing: their ship was lucky. They survived under the crossfire of heavy artillery. They chased German torpedo boats, the agile Schnellboots, that tried to attack convoys at night. Laffey learned to bite back. Its gunners began to act as a single mechanism. They thought they had seen war. They thought the worst was behind them. After all, Europe was being liberated. Nazi Germany was living its final months. The command appreciated the destroyer's success. Combat experience, a coordinated team, excellent hardware. Such a ship was needed where the war showed no sign of ending. The order was received. Course for the Panama Canal. Laffey was being transferred to the Pacific. The sailors rejoiced. Warm sun, exotic islands, and an enemy who had almost no fleet left. None of them guessed they were heading towards something that defied Western logic. The Pacific greeted Laffey with deceptive calm. Azure water, white clouds, an endless horizon. But the veterans who had already been here knew this beauty was deadly. By 1945, the war with Japan had turned into something unparalleled in history. The Imperial fleet, once the pride of the nation, lay at the bottom. The carriers were sunk. The best pilots who attacked Pearl Harbor had long since died at Midway or over the Solomon Islands. Japan was backed into a corner. U.S. industry was churning out ships faster than the Japanese could count them. But a wounded beast with nothing to lose had one last argument, a logic inaccessible to the Western mind. If we don't have experienced pilots to win a dogfight, we don't need dogfights. If our planes are inferior to American Hellcats and Corsairs, we don't need complex maneuvers. We only need one thing: to turn the plane into a guided missile, and the pilot into part of the guidance system. Thus was born the Tokutai tactic, special attack units. We know them by another name, Kamikaze, the divine wind. This is a reference to the legendary typhoon of the 13th century that destroyed the Mongol fleet of Kublai Khan and saved Japan from invasion. Now, the role of the typhoon was to be played by thousands of young men. They were given a cup of sake, a hachimaki headband with the rising sun, and a one-way ticket. For American sailors, it was a shock. In Europe, they fought the Germans. The Germans were brutal, professional, but understandable. If a German pilot was hit, he bailed out with a parachute. If a German sub was sinking, it surfaced and surrendered. Here, everything was different. The enemy didn't want to live. The enemy wanted to take you with him. It broke the psyche. How do you fight someone for whom your death is more important than their own life? Kamikazes used anything that could fly. Old Zero fighters, Val dive bombers, Kate torpedo bombers, and even training biplanes packed to the brim with explosives. The tactic was frighteningly simple. A group of planes approached the fleet at an extremely low altitude, hiding behind the radio horizon, or conversely, dropped like a stone from the clouds. The anti-aircraft gunners were going crazy. You see chunks of fuselage flying off the plane. It's on fire, it has no wing, but it keeps flying at you anyway. By April 1945, this tactic reached its peak. The American fleet approached Okinawa. This was the last bastion before the invasion of the Japanese home islands. The Japanese command understood. If Okinawa falls, the war is over. Therefore, they prepared Operation Kikasui, Floating Chrysanthemum. 10 massive attacks. Thousands of suicide planes. The sky was meant to turn black with machines bearing cherry blossom symbols on their fuselages. Laffey was heading into the very center of this storm. The crew heard the rumors. They saw photos of the mangled carriers Franklin and Bunker Hill. They knew the Japanese were no longer just aiming for the water. They were aiming for the superstructures, the bridge, the funnels, where the explosion would cause maximum pain. The sailors cleaned their machine guns and cannons with redoubled diligence. Every speck of dust in the mechanism could cost the life of the entire ship. The tension on board could be cut with a knife. Radar operators stared at green screens until their eyes ached, terrified of missing that one fatal pixel. And soon, that pixel appeared. Laffey received an order to take a position that sailors considered a death sentence. The American fleet at Okinawa faced a problem. Japanese planes flew low over the water, hiding in the folds of the terrain and using the Earth's curvature. The radars of the large carriers and battleships standing in the center of the formation saw them too late. When a kamikaze appeared on the screen, the gunners had seconds to react. This was unacceptable. The admirals came up with a solution, cruel but effective. They created a radar picket ring. Around the island, at a distance of up to 100 kilometers from the main forces, single destroyers were stationed. 16 stations. 16 points in the open ocean. The task of these ships was simple. Detect the enemy first. Warn the fleet. Direct the fighters. In essence, they were a living shield. Canaries in a coal mine. Of all these points, the most dangerous was Station Number 1. It was located north of Okinawa, right in the flight path of aircraft from the Japanese island of Kyushu. Any group of planes flying to bomb the American fleet inevitably ran into the ship at this point. Being here meant being target number 1. For inexperienced Japanese pilots, who only had enough fuel for a one-way trip, a lone destroyer seemed like a gift from fate. Why fly further, searching for carriers through thick fire, if here it is, the target, a fat, juicy American target? On April 14th, Laffey received orders to occupy Station Number 1. Along with it, they sent 2 support ships, LCS landing craft, armed only with light guns. That was all the cover. The crew of Laffey understood what this meant. They replaced another destroyer at this position that had already been damaged. Captain Beckton, commander of the Laffey, did not hide the truth from his men. He said simply, "We have hot work ahead of us. Check everything." 2 days passed in nervous anticipation. The radar spun, slicing through the void. Sailors slept in their clothes at the guns. Cooks carried sandwiches and endless coffee directly to battle stations. The silence pressed on the ears harder than thunder. The ocean was calm, but it was the lull before the storm. The Japanese were preparing the third massive raid of Operation Kikasui. The morning of April 16th began as usual. Sunrise, a light breeze, watch change. But at 8 in the morning, the radar operator in the Combat Information Center tensed up. The green sweep line hit an obstacle. A dot. 1. A second later, 2 more. Then 5. The operator rubbed his eyes, hoping they were clouds or a flock of birds. But the dots moved quickly and purposefully. He reported to the bridge. Contact. Bearing 030. Distance 20 miles. Multiple targets. Captain Becton raised his binoculars. Nothing was visible on the horizon. But the radar continued to go crazy. The number of dots grew exponentially. 10, 20, 50. The radar screen literally turned white from the number of targets. This wasn't a patrol. It wasn't reconnaissance. It was an armada. 165 Japanese planes took to the air that morning, and the first 50 of them were flying straight for Laffey. At 8:25 in the morning, the lookout on the mast shouted into the voice tube, "Sighting planes! Dead ahead!" The battle alarm siren wailed, tearing through the morning silence. The sound chilled to the bone. Men ran up the ladders, taking their places according to the battle bill. Loaders rammed shells into the breaches. Gunners turned their wheels. Thousands of eyes looked into the sky, which was turning from blue to black, with dots before their eyes. The swarm was approaching, and it was hungry. The sky tore apart. That is not a metaphor. The air around Laffey turned into a solid wall of steel and fire. The main battery spoke first. The 5-inch turrets swung toward the threat and began spitting shells every 4 seconds. American engineers had given the fleet a secret weapon: VT proximity fuses. These shells didn't need to hit the plane exactly. They only had to fly near it. A tiny radar in the nose of the shell sensed the enemy's metal and gave the command to detonate. The sky was covered with black ink blots of explosions. The first Japanese planes, Val dive bombers, hit this invisible wall. One after another, they lost wings, burst into torches, and fell into the water kilometers before reaching the ship. The crew cheered. It seemed to be working. "We're holding them!" The combat air patrol joined the fight. American Corsairs and Hellcats hung over the destroyer, lunging at the Japanese like wolfhounds. It was chaos in 3 dimensions. Laffey's gunners had to show incredible restraint. You can't shoot when your own fighter is on the tail of the enemy. They had to wait a second or two until the trajectories diverged. When the planes that broke through came closer, the Bofors stepped in. 40mm quad mounts. Their rhythmic, dull thumping, tum, 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 created a bass backing to the whine of aircraft engines. Tracers drew lines of fire in the sky. Japanese pilots tried to maneuver, but the density of fire was such that dodging was mathematically impossible. One of the valves came in from the stern. It flew low, almost touching the waves to evade the radar. The gunners spotted it visually. The 20mm Ehrlichens rattled like sewing machines. The Kamikaze pilot already saw the bridge. He had already chosen his impact point. But a burst raked the cockpit and the engine. The plane put its nose down and crashed into the water 50 meters from the side. A pillar of water drenched the aft superstructure. Salt spray mixed with the sweat on the sailors' faces. Captain Becton threw the ship from side to side. Full ahead, left full rudder, full astern, right full rudder. The 3,000-ton destroyer spun like a top. The deck slipped from under their feet. Loaders fell but continued to hand over clips. The gun barrels glowed red hot. The paint on them began to bubble and peel. By the 30th minute of the battle, Laffey had already downed 6 planes. Several more fell thanks to the fighters. The crew began to believe in their invincibility. They were fighting back. They were the wall against which the waves broke. But the Japanese quickly understood the tactic. Single attacks weren't working. And then they did what every captain feared. They stopped attacking one by one. They attacked all at once. From different sides, from different heights, synchronously. 8:30 in the morning. This moment became the point where luck turned away. 2 Japanese Val dive bombers came from the stern simultaneously. The gunners tore one to shreds, but the second broke through the wall of fire. He dropped a bomb that hit the aft 5-inch gun turret directly. The explosion rocked the ship from keel to masthead. But that was only the beginning. The plane itself, turned into a ball of fire, crashed into that same turret a second later. Aviation fuel poured into the handling room. Fire instantly consumed the men inside. Captain Becton on the bridge felt a blow that nearly knocked him off his feet. He looked back. Where a second ago the stern of the destroyer had been, a black pillar of smoke 300 meters high was now rising. Communication with the aft posts was cut. But the most terrifying thing was reported by the helmsman. The rudder was jammed. 26 degrees to the port side. Laffey had lost control. Now it could only go in circles, like a wounded animal waiting for a predator. And the predators saw it. The Japanese realized the ship was immobilized. The next attack was surgical. Another Val came from the bow, dropped a bomb, and crashed into the superstructure. The bomb exploded in the officer's wardroom, turning it into a mess of steel and furniture. The shockwave blew out all the glass on the bridge, deafening the officers. A minute later, 2 more planes hit the midships area. One of them, an Oscar fighter, crashed into the mast, showering the deck with a rain of burning debris and fuel. Laffey's deck turned into a slick rink of oil, blood, and seawater. Men slipped and fell, but they got up and returned to their machine guns. But here is a scene that was forever etched into the memory of the survivors. The aft 5-inch turret number 53 was destroyed by a direct hit. It was simply blown away. But the shell hoist mechanisms from the magazine, located deep below, continued to work. The boys down there, in the dark and heat, didn't know there was no one left above. They continued to methodically send heavy shells up. They were loading a ghost gun. The shells rolled out onto the burning deck, risking detonation from the heat at any second. By 9 in the morning, Laffey had taken 6 kamikaze hits and 4 bombs. Most of the artillery was silent. The power was out. The radars were blind. The ship settled by the stern so deep that water began to wash over the fantail superstructures. The fire was creeping toward the main magazines. If the fire reached them, the explosion would tear the destroyer into atoms. One of the junior officers ran up to Captain Beckton. His face was black with soot, his uniform torn. He screamed through the noise of the fire. "Sir, we have to abandon ship. We're sinking. The stern is already underwater." Beckton looked at him. Then he looked at the forward guns, which were still snapping with short bursts at the passing shadows. His answer entered the history of the American Navy. "I'll never abandon ship as long as a single gun will fire." It was madness. The only rational decision was to save the men. But Beckton saw something others didn't. He felt that the ship's keel was still intact. Laffey trembled, burned, and listed, but it held the water. The kamikazes, seeing that the ship had turned into a torch, began to turn away, choosing other targets. They thought the job was done, that this piece of burning metal was already dead. They were wrong. When the last Japanese engine faded in the distance, silence fell. It was more terrifying than the roar. In this silence, only the crackle of flames and the groans of the wounded could be heard. Laffey was burning. It resembled a colander. The holes in the deck were so huge a car could fall through them. The stern had gone underwater almost to the gun turret. The rudder was jammed tight, turning the destroyer into an unmanageable hunk of metal. It seemed the ocean was about to do what the kamikazes couldn't: swallow it whole. But then, another team entered the fight. The damage control parties. Boys in rubberized suits, with axes, hoses, and wooden beams. These were not shooters or pointers. These were carpenters, electricians, and mechanics. In ordinary life, their work is invisible. But now, the lives of 300 people depended on them. They descended into the very inferno, into smoke-filled compartments where water mixed with oil up to their knees. Their task was impossible. Patch holes that were larger than the patches. Pump out water with pumps working at their limit. Cool bulkheads behind which tons of explosives lay. They worked in complete darkness, lighting the way only with hand lanterns. The air was heated to 100 degrees. Men collapsed from heat stroke. They were doused with water from a bucket and stood back up to the pumps. To save the stern, the ship had to be lightened. The captain gave the order: "Overboard with everything extra!" The sailors began to throw away mangled iron, plane wreckage, empty casings, personal belongings. Safes with documents, furniture, and spare parts flew into the water. They threw away everything except hope. And the ship reciprocated. It stopped sinking. The draft stabilized. The keel, that steel spine of the ship, withstood the monstrous blows and did not snap. Minesweepers and tugs approached to help. When the crews of other ships saw the Laffey, they lost their breath. The superstructures were crushed like an accordion. The mast hung by a thread. The entire hull was black with soot. But on the stump of the mast, the American flag still flew. Ragged, scorched, but it was there. Towing to the anchorage at Caramaretto took several hours. It was a procession of ghosts. When the mutilated destroyer entered the harbor, the crews of other ships spilled onto the decks. First, there was a graveyard silence, and then the applause began. Men on battleships and cruisers, who had seen much, applauded the little destroyer that refused to die. Captain Beckton stood on his ruined bridge. He was black with soot, barely standing on his feet from exhaustion, but he had brought his ship home. The price of that day was terrible. 32 dead, 71 wounded. Almost a third of the crew was out of action. The deck had to be scrubbed for several days. But Laffey survived. It became a legend even before it was put into dry dock. The engineers who examined the damage shook their heads. They couldn't believe their eyes. According to their calculations, this ship should have sunk 3 times over. But metal has a memory, and this metal remembered that it could not be destroyed. Laffey was repaired. It returned to service. It went through another war, in Korea. It served in the Cold War. It seemed this ship was immortal. But every ship has an enemy more terrifying than a kamikaze: time and rust. Most war heroes end their lives the same way. They are cut up for scrap. Proud battleships and swift destroyers go to the smelter, turning into cars and refrigerators. But Laffey cheated death again. After World War II, it didn't go to rest. It underwent modernization. Its silhouette changed. New radars and new masts appeared. But the heart remained the same. It went to a new war, in Korea. There, in cold waters, it again covered landings, again fought duels with shore batteries, again took hits, and again stayed afloat. It served until the mid-70s. The era was changing. Missiles replaced artillery. Gas and nuclear reactors replaced steam turbines. Laffey became a dinosaur, a relic of a bygone age when the outcome of a battle was decided not by computers, but by the eyes of a pointer and the muscles of a loader. In 1975, the flag was lowered. It seemed this was the finale. The path to the scrapyard was open. But this ship had a soul that was too loud. The veterans, those same boys who burned in '45 off Okinawa, couldn't let their savior disappear. They began a campaign for its rescue, and they won. Laffey became the first museum ship of its class. It dropped anchor at Patriots Point, South Carolina, next to the giant aircraft carrier Yorktown. It seemed like a happy ending. But Laffey's story is an endless struggle. The enemy returned. Quiet, invisible, and ruthless. Saltwater. Decades of sitting at the pier did what the Kamikazes couldn't. The hull began to rot from the inside. By 2009, the plating had become as thin as paper. Water began to enter the bilges. The ship that withstood 4 aerial bombs was at risk of sinking, right at the museum pier, in peacetime. And again, people came to the rescue. It was a unique operation. Laffey was pulled out of the silt, taken under tow, and brought to dry dock. When engineers saw the bottom, they were horrified. There were hundreds of holes. The metal had simply vanished. But they patched it. They welded on new steel sheets. They painted it in that same haze gray color it wore in '44. Millions of dollars in donations and thousands of man-hours of work brought it back to life. Today, if you step on its deck, you can feel it. The smell of machine oil that hasn't faded in decades. The cold of the steel railings. The tightness of the battle stations. Walk into the Combat Information Center. It's dark and quiet there. But if you close your eyes and listen, you can hear the echo. You can hear the cries of the lookouts. Bonsai on the starboard side. You can hear the rhythmic thump of the bofors. You can hear the clang of the 5-inch breeches. And the voice of Captain Beckton, who, through the roar of explosions, says, "As long as one gun fires, we're alive." Laffey today is more than a museum. It is a monument to human stubbornness. It is a reminder that even when the sky falls to the ground and hope seems like madness, you can stand your ground. You can survive hell and return home. In the history of the fleet, there were many ships. There were more powerful battleships. There were faster cruisers. But none of them earned their nickname as honestly as this destroyer, the ship that would not die. And as long as we remember its story, as long as we tell it to our children, as long as we touch its armor, it is truly immortal. Steel rusts, people pass away, but legends do not sink. Friends, thank you for your attention. Tell me, what part of this story impressed you the most? I'll be waiting for your answers in the comments.